Good afternoon, y'all. I'm speaking to you by video today because this is one of those days that I warned you might occur earlier in the semester. As part of my duties as chair of the Faculty Senate, I'm responsible for conducting a second-year review of the president. So I have to coordinate this with the Board of Regents, and Regent Chair Craig Turner was only available to meet during a small period of time today, and it lands right on top of class. So I have agreed to attend the first part of that meeting, but needed to be there at least long enough so that we could map out a plan for how we're going to proceed with the president's evaluation. So for that reason, I asked Hannah to come to class today and get us started. So by now, I'm sure she's taken attendance and gotten you all organized, and so here we go. Let me alert you to what's coming up. We've just started a new section in our course where we're talking about the history of education. This is a long, big bunch of information, most of it disjointed. It's like what I think of as a bullet list kind of a history, which tells you events, but doesn't necessarily do a very good job of connecting the dots and applying meaning to different kinds of historical things that have occurred. So today in class, I'm going to try to give you a very broad sort of an outline that covers the ancient world, Middle Ages, some of the earlier elements of education in the world, and just give you some additional perspective, hopefully to allow you to connect some of those dots. So this will take place, this historical study will take place during weeks 7, 8, and 9. Now let me warn you that in your module for week 7, I went back and listened to the audio on that, and I did something I try not to do, but I talked about dates when things were due, and those dates are now inaccurate. Of course, every semester the dates change a little bit, so let me alert you to that, but the information is the same. It's a 3-week study on history. We'll move from the ancient world up to modern times. And in that study, we'll have different activities going on. So today we're going to chat. Next week, you're going to have some issues that we will deal with in class. So I'll break you all up into 5 groups, give you a topic to discuss, and then each group will kind of report out their conversation to the class. In week 9, we're going to have an in-class debate where we will divide up into groups, and we will replicate the debate that was held between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois on the question of what should be done about the education of African Americans roughly around the year 1900. So that's a little quick peek at what's coming up in the next 3 weeks. And of course, spring break follows that. Our test on this history section will occur in week 9. Now, we also have no new assignments this week in your module, but you're going to notice that the amount of reading and notes have gone up. Plus, there is a series of videos that we'll begin watching during this history section, or we will watch during the history section. And it's a very good series of films from the public broadcasting system about schools. And what they've done is they've collected some of our best educational historians nationally to tell in picture and story form what was happening in American education at different times in our history. So there will be 4 of those videos, very well produced. If you've seen any of the material that Ken Burns does, it's that style of a presentation. But I hope you enjoy it, and I think you'll find it to be very informative. Did I mention our test will be in week 9? Also, I need to alert you to the fact that next week we're going to have a change in our class schedule. We will not meet on Tuesday. Instead, our class will meet on Thursday. I believe that's March the 12th. Now, the reason for this change is because next week is undergraduate advising for the College of Education. And you will be notified by your advisor or by someone in the college of a means to schedule an appointment with your advisor. And of course, this is a very important time. This is a time to assess how you're doing in your college work, to make plans for the upcoming semester. When you go to meet with your advisor, you should have a pretty good idea about what courses you think you ought to be taking. Sit down with your advisor, compare those courses with the classes that are in your program, and let that advisor help you avoid any kind of problems or delays that can sometimes be caused because a certain course maybe isn't offered in a certain semester, or any little particular glitches or changes to programs. We've had several of those of late. So work with your advisor to make sure that you have the most efficient path through your college studies. Remember, it all comes down to time and money. If you've got all the money in the world, then feel free to take 8 years to graduate. It won't hurt a thing. Most of us don't have that circumstance, and we need to be careful stewards of our own personal finances and get through our college program as efficiently as we can. And of course, complicating that is the fact that many of you have to work a lot of hours while you're attending college, and so that also has to be factored in. So work with your advisor, figure out what you need to do, and I hope everyone will be successful. Well, what I'd like to do now is just begin some of our conversation about education in the ancient world. As you know, I'm a former school principal. I spent 30 years in the schools, and I know a lot of the practical stuff. I was not a scholar by trade. I didn't start out thinking that I was going to teach in higher education. That idea actually came to me a bit later when I decided to pursue my doctorate. And so somewhere around 1990, in preparation for this work, I began doing a study of the history of education. Just because it interested me, and that's where I found that I gravitated. What I was really looking for were the antecedents to those things, to how our schools are today. And I didn't say that very well, but let me explain. What I did is I began with the current schooling in Kentucky, and then I started working my way backwards through the historical record. And every time I found a new thing that was still with us in schools today, I tried to note that. And by doing that, I sort of worked backwards to try to find a story that would answer the question, what is it that makes schools today the way they are? What were those elements, even from ancient times, that are still with us today? And by that means, I hope to sort of frame up the parameters of what American education is. Now, I have to confess at the outset, there are a lot of influences to American education that are left out of this story. Influences of Latino education, particularly in the Southwest U.S., is largely missing from this, except for when later we get into some of the social justice issues, we're going to run into that. Asian influence on education, largely absent. Again, we'll touch on that some in our reading, but it's not a main strand of what I found that made American schools what they are. Rather, as you probably are well aware, most of the influence in American education comes from what I think of as the Western civilization area of study, from Greece to Rome to Western Europe, particularly England, then into America, and there are a lot of other influences, but that was the general stream of how things flowed. So to start with, this afternoon, what I'd like to do is just outline a couple of the issues for you to think about in the ancient world. As you're reading through that material, one of the first things I'd like you to consider is that there was very little sense of change in the ancient world. I mean, if you think about it, it had to be extremely difficult to live as a caveman. I mean, they invented fire, and then a million years later began shelter construction. So the idea of change as you and I think about it, there is no concept of that, much to speak of at all in the ancient world. The wheel was discovered in 3500 BC. There were hundreds and hundreds of years between critical inventions. And so that's one thing that I'd like you to have a sense of. If you took an ancient person and you dropped them in today's world, the pace of change would just be dizzying and very disorienting. I mean, think about the technological advances that have occurred just during your lifetime. And you compare that to someone like me. When I was born, television was brand new. Radio had been around. I'm not that old. But TV was new. You guys probably don't use DVDs a whole lot. I mean, things are streaming now. Technology continues to change, and that's just something that didn't occur in the ancient world. Another point I'd like you to try to consider is that there was no sense of the individual in the ancient world. It was the state. It was the powerful who drove what common folk did. And the reason that's important is that if there's no sense of the individual, then why should you be educated? Why should I be educated? I'm not the son of a rich man. I'm not studied in the priesthood. And those were generally the people who were getting educated in all the way up through the Middle Ages. So how you were born probably said more about whether or not you were likely to be educated and what kind of education you were likely to get than anything else. The idea of educating the public was not considered to be important much at all. Also, the ancient world gives us an oral tradition. There weren't very good ways of recording information in the ancient world. It was difficult. The technologies that existed were not replicable in such a sense that I could put something on papyrus and have that go out across the world and have a lot of people read it. That wasn't going to happen. Carvings in stone, whatever kinds of recording instruments they had that evolved through the ancient world were not accessible to most people. Paper doesn't get invented until somewhere around the year 1000 and doesn't come to Europe until much, much later. So there's a whole lot of limitation there. And because of that, the way people learned is much like we're doing today. It's an oral tradition where one person would tell a story to another person, and they would pick up information from that and compare that to their lives and try to make sense and meaning out of that information. We also see the first instances of the teacher-student relationship and how that was manifested. And it begins from the very start with the first teacher that we're really aware of on record by name, and that was a fellow named Socrates. Socrates, of course, was a famous philosopher and teacher who lived in ancient Greece, has an interesting kind of a story, and we wouldn't know anything about Socrates if it wasn't for Plato. Plato was his star student, and he wrote about Socrates and what he learned from him, and so that's how we understand a lot of this material. Socrates, if we were to see him today, would look, I'm sure, like a bum. He was not a rich person. He essentially wandered the streets. He had 20 to 30 men who would follow him around. Those were his students. And as he approached something in Athens, he would ask questions about it. He would pose challenging kinds of issues and questions that his students would then think about critically. And the reason that Socrates stays with us is because he actually, the way he approached his teaching was through a method that now bears his name. We talk about Socratic method. And that is a method of teaching whereby the instructor asks a particular kind of question, and given the difficulty of that question, can cause the learner to think at different cognitive levels. We'll see this much, much later in our reading, as that is arrayed in what's known as Bloom's taxonomy. It is a listing of the different cognitive levels. This is critically important stuff for teachers to understand. If I ask you what color the little girl's hood was, you're going to think red. But it's not a very heavy lift. Red Riding Hood, okay, I know that from my childhood. That is a very basic knowledge level kind of a question. But what if I ask you to put yourself in the place of Little Red Riding Hood and make a judgment about whether or not she should have gone to visit Granny that day? Well, that requires a different level of consideration. Now you have to understand something about the setting. You have to be able to evaluate Little Red Riding Hood from her perspective and make some judgment about the hazards that she was likely to face along the way. So the way the teacher poses a question causes the learner to think at a different cognitive level. And Socrates was the first one to really bring this to us through the Socratic method. As I mentioned, his star student was Plato. Plato's ideas were much like what we would think of as the Olympics. He saw classes of individuals who would need education. He described artisans, soldiers, and philosophers, where an artisan only needed a certain amount of craft, what we would think about today as vocational education. And so they wouldn't have to be taught very long. Soldiers were kind of worker bees. They would have some level of education, maybe even lower than that of the artisan. But the philosopher was the person who was being trained for leadership, maybe being trained for the church or clergy or for government service. And that individual would require the highest level. And he even thought of it in terms of gold, silver, and bronze to reflect that Olympic kind of an idea. Plato also had a star student. His name was Aristotle. Aristotle was into realism. He actually was the first person that we know of that began to formalize an idea about science education. And his notion was collecting things. The encyclopedia, the understanding of all knowledge comes to us from Aristotle. And so he would collect things, classify things, and begin to understand how they related to one another. This really comes to some level of fruition through Aristotle's star student, who was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, as you probably know from your history studies, went on to conquer the known world at that time. But every place Alexander went, he would send some of his soldiers back to Greece, and they would take with them samples of things. An animal that they discovered that they had never seen before. Soil samples, plant samples. Whatever Alexander came across that was of interest to him, he would ship back via one of his soldiers so that Aristotle could study it and classify it and contribute to this kind of scientific method that was just beginning. I also think of Aristotle as kind of the patron saint of physical education. Some of his ideas were pretty sexist. We're going to see that throughout our history, and I'm sure women are accustomed to that by now. Not saying that they should be adjusted to it, but just that it is a historical fact that there's a lot of sexism that is involved in the education of students throughout the years, and Aristotle was certainly no exception to that. But as far as PE was concerned, he had this idea that a person didn't really know what they were made of until they were tested. And back in those days, the way you tested yourself was either on the field of battle, which could cost you your life or some part of it, or tested on the athletic field. And for those of you that have competed in athletics, you understand this issue already. I mean, you may think that you are better than your opponent, but until you're on the field and you're tested against that other individual who wants the same thing that you want, maybe you don't really know what you're made of. Maybe you don't know how strong you are. So we continually test ourselves. And in Aristotle's mind, this led to virtue. So we see a lot of these ideas about what is education, what's good about it. Socrates thought knowledge in and of itself was virtuous. That an educated person, when faced with a difficult decision, would naturally choose the right, ethical, moral choice. I'm not sure that's true, but it certainly contributes to knowledge of what would be a good choice and what might be a poor choice. And so these things come to us from the ancient world, and they're still very much a part of the way we educate kids today. Let me jump to Rome in a couple of hundred years, and we come to a fellow named Quintilian. Quintilian is the first professional educator that we're aware of, and he was hired to be a professor of eloquence. Back in ancient Greece, Socrates, for example, didn't believe that a teacher should be paid. He saw it more as a natural obligation for those who were capable of teaching, and it should be given away, much to his wife's chagrin. But Quintilian was hired as a professor of eloquence, or a professor of oratory. And this contributes to this idea of the importance of the oral tradition in the ancient world. If oral tradition is important, and if ancient governments were to control citizens and control information to those citizens, then it was of a high value to be able to have someone who could do that well, and do that in a convincing kind of a fashion. And so Quintilian was hired to do that. You're probably aware, in the ancient world, the way a lot of news got transmitted was through someone that they called a newsreader, who would stand on the steps of the Senate at a certain time each day, and he would make proclamations and say, Marcus Aurelius's troops have just crossed this river, or whatever. And they would sort of keep the news in front of the people by that means. That's also a very, very state-controlled kind of an expression of information. Well, I've gone about 20 minutes now, so hopefully this will give me time to rejoin you in class, and we'll pick up our discussion with the Middle Ages on my return. See you soon.